And welcome to this special episode of Church and State. My name is Stephen Cox. Today, I welcome two distinguished guests who are new to the program. SD Wright from WM Review, as well as Rayan, purveyor of the Radical Fidelity Substack. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, Sean. Nice to be here.
Hello, both. Thank you very much.
Well, I wanted to have you both on because you both wrote about this proposal that has been in the news the last 24 hours that was written by a French priest and reported on by Diane Montaigne. And it seeks to encourage the Cardinals at the consistory in the Vatican to urge Leo, who was not given this proposal, to adapt and have a sort of worldwide universal jurisdiction for everybody who is, quote, attached to the Latin Mass, what the document calls the older form, the traditional liturgy. It was reported on by Diane Montaigne, and it was written by a French priest, given to several of the cardinals, 15 in particular, and then more later, emailed to them. It's basically a proposal which seemingly is not new. It's calling for at least some sort of enclave, a jurisdiction for those who are attached to the Latin Mass. Sean, you know who this priest who wrote this document is, or at least you're familiar with his history. It doesn't seem most of the public are, however, as Diane Montaigne reports that he was at once upon a time associated with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, but she doesn't give much details about who he actually is. You wrote about him on your Substack. I'll bring us up on the screen. Tell us more about him, if you could.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by some of the absence of info about Father de Blignières in Diane's article. I thought she skipped over a really significant part of his career, really. So he was a seminarian at Icone for the Society of St. Pius X under Archbishop Lefebvre. He was ordained in 1977, and he was supposed to be working with the now infamous Dom Gérard Calvet of Le Barroux. That was the Benedictine community that worked with Archbishop Lefebvre for a long time, and then rallied in 1988 following the consecrations. But actually, Father de Blignières, he rallied earlier, but also he did something else earlier, which is he became what is commonly called a sedevacantist. In 1979, he departed from the Society of St. Pius X, or at least its orbit, and from Dom Gérard, in order to work with then Father Michel-Louis Gérard de Laurier, who is well known now as having received episcopal ordination at the hands of Bishop Took, and for having formulated what's known as the Cassiciacum thesis, which is a way of explaining exactly how it is that the see is vacant. They would say it's formally vacant but materially occupied, in the sense that the men have had legitimate elections, but have, for reasons, haven't been able to receive the authority of the papacy. So essentially, they haven't been true popes. That's the conclusion of this. So Father de Blignières, he worked with Father Gérard de Laurier for some time, approximately 8 or so years, I'd say. In that time, though, it is interesting that Father Gérard de Laurier kind of didn't really trust him so much. He had his concerns about him. He kind of saw where this was going. He said of him, he will be a man for the best or for the worst. And in 1982, he wrote of him, I already cannot be sure of him. He seems too anxious to maintain easy contact with all. This is not reassuring. When Father Gérard de Laurier was consecrated, this goes from my mind, I think it was 1983, Father de Blignières really was not happy with this and protested strongly. But in 1987, that's when he kind of formally made his agreements with Rome and the Vatican, and took his community, which was the Fraternity of St. Vincent Ferrer, a sort of Dominican-inspired sedepravationist community until that point. He took it, and it was regularized. And then in '88, he managed to secure an indult to be able to be a kind of properly pseudo-Dominican order using the Dominican books and so on. I was quite surprised that all that, which is kind of quite significant, was omitted in Diane's article.
Yeah.
She mentioned that he was involved in the negotiations in '88, which led to the indult, which I thought kind of gave the impression that he rallied at that point and had been with Lefebvre up to that point. But as you can see, there's a bit of a gap there.
Yeah, no, she also mentions here, and I'll bring this up, it's part of your blog, it's sort of like pouring salt in the wound here. In 1988, quote, following the illicit episcopal consecrations by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, Father de Blignières was among the clergy who engaged in dialogue with John Paul II. So it kind of tells you where she's coming from. But I'll bring up here on the screen, I put this up while you were talking there, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
Here is an image of Monsignor Delaurier on the right, Archbishop Lefebvre in the center, and Dom Gerard on the left. And this really does seem to be, at least this proposal of the Dom Gerard mentality, which was actually at the time opposed by Lefebvre himself, as well as the SSPX even in later years. And I've written about this on the Substack. And I want to just spend a bit more time on this because, again, this proposal, and you can comment, Sean, on whether you think it's even anything that's substantially different than the status quo. Really, again, the mentality, the SSPX rebuffed this back in the day. And they even said, Father Fleischmann, who was a priest with him, this is Father Fleischmann here, said this was an erroneous mentality. And I'll scroll down to the three parts here that are most significant. And those arguments were basically, if I can find it here, that it is better to be in good relations with the Vatican because more souls will come to you. That was one argument Dom Gerard had made. Second, it is better to have tradition regularized instead of being ostracized. And three, it is better to be at peace, in other words, coexisting with the conciliar authorities. And the SSPX said, no, that's not necessarily something that we should be doing at this time. Sean, can you comment more on his approach and the SSPX reaction to it back then?
Yeah, I mean, look, what he says there, they're powerful arguments, really. And, if we look at something like Summorum Pontificum, or this kind of proposal here, or the original indult in '88 that they're talking about there, well, I think it's important that we don't take a completely ham-fisted approach and deny that good can come from such things, and indeed has come from such things. I mean, I think a lot of good has come from something like Summorum Pontificum, but that doesn't change the fact that a lot of evil has come from it, and it's not really about weighing up one or the other to get a balance. And we also know that we can't do evil that good may come. Although I think, for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into here, the good that comes from these things is significantly outweighed by the denial of dogma and doctrine that is required implicitly by these proposals here. So, I mean, Archbishop Lefebvre was in favour of this so-called experiment of tradition, which really describes this whole idea, being allowed to have a degree of autonomy from the diocesan bishops, being able to just kind of get on with things and act as a leaven. He voiced this, the earliest I could find in a cursory look yesterday was 73, and he was voicing it in 87. So he was really kind of holding out for this kind of idea on and off throughout that period. And it was at 88 that he, I think we could say, slammed the door shut on that idea and ruled it out in the strongest possible terms.
Yeah, there was a maturation to Lefebvre's thought, obviously. It was after the consecrations where he took a more hardline stance against the so-called experiment tradition. He even said himself to enter into this conciliar system to somehow change it as a fool's errand. And I'll bring up on the screen here, because I think this is important too. Even Father Schmidberger, who just recently over in Germany, they celebrated for his 50th year of being a priest. Here's what Father Schmidberger said, actually in response to Dom Gerard's move to reconcile with the conciliar authorities. He said, quote, "It seems rather contrary to the plan of divine providence that the Catholic tradition of the Church be reintegrated into the pluralism of the conciliar Church. as long as the latter dishonors the Catholic Church and scandalizes its unity and visibility. Second point, it's an honor for Le Beroux, this is Father Schmittberger speaking, to have been rejected by the other Benedictines for its integral fidelity to the Mass of all times, and thus to have been a wonderful sign of contradiction. And when the laws of the Church are abused everywhere in such a way as to desiccate the living source of faith, it is better not to succumb to this scheme. And then lastly, if the priests of Le Beroux considered that they were validly suspended, they have been living in mortal sin for 15 years. The harder way of the cross is more fruitful for the easy way. Sean, I'll give you a last comment on this and we'll move on. And then Rianne, if you want to jump in here as well, I'd like your thoughts on some of this too.
Yeah, if we look back at what was said in 88, there many things were said in 88 and following it. But one particular document, which is one of my favorites, is the open letter that was written to one of the cardinals by all the superiors and I think also the heads of the religious houses of the district. Yeah, that's it. We published it recently as well. I think we did a new translation of it, if I recall. Yeah.
Would you like me to read this here, Sean?
Yeah, I'll read my translation because it's obviously better. This is what they said then, right? We have never wished to belong to that system which styles itself the Conciliar Church and which defines itself by the Novus Ordo Missae, by indifferentist ecumenism, and by the secularization of the whole of society. Yes, we have no part, nullam partem habemus, with the pantheon of religions of Assisi. Our own excommunication by a decree of your eminence or of another dicastery would only be irrefutable proof of this. We would ask for nothing better than to be declared excommunione from the adulterous spirit, which has blown through the church for 25 years, excluded from the impious communion with unbelievers. End quote. I mean, I feel like there's a sort of tendency now to look at documents like this and say, oh yeah, well, everyone was angry and stressed and emotions were running high in 88. When, now we see things clearer. And I just think, are you kidding? Like, if that was true then, it's true now. And if it wasn't true then, if you can say such things in a fit of passion, then how seriously are we supposed to take you?
Absolutely. Brianne, what are your thoughts initially?
Yes, yeah, Sean, I definitely want to agree with you there. Listening to that, I mean, that was written in 1988. Things are so much worse now. I think that's a beautiful quote, nicely, strongly worded and all, but I think we can use even stronger statements than that right now to dismiss any ideas or any notions of wanting to experiment with tradition or to hobnob with the post-conciliar religion, which I repeatedly just say is not Catholicism. And I think it's time people should stop fooling themselves, and I think especially the trad-in crowd should stop calling it Catholicism because it's confusing to the laity and to the faithful. But yeah, if things were bad in 1988, it's much, much worse now, and so much more reason for rejecting any suggestions like Father de Blignières' proposal.
Before we move on, can I just give you this very short sentence from Archbishop Lefebvre in his short work, Spiritual Journey, which was written around this time. He said, "It is therefore a strict duty for every priest wanting to remain Catholic to separate himself from this conciliar church for as long as it does not rediscover the tradition of the church and of the Catholic faith."
Yeah. Amen. And Rianne, I want to turn to your Substack as well, because you notice a lot of the language in here. You talk about how the text itself, especially the interview with Diane Montagna and Father Raffray, speaking about attachment to the traditional Mass. The Vitus Ordo is a term that appears frequently in their interview. What did you pick up on the language that was used? Because a lot of these terms that are used are very purposefully used, I think.
Yes. As I said in my article, and I didn't say it for like effect, it's literally a case of when I read those things and as I'm writing, I'm getting angry. If we look at exactly those terms he just brought up now, Vitus Ordo, first of all, is a modernist retrospective label that's been shoved onto the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, that's basically just telling people this is, it means old order. So that's basically saying to people, or that's implying, and I don't think it's accidental. I think it's very intentional. I'm not saying Diane Montana or Father, what's his name, Rafferty. I don't think they necessarily have some bad intentions. I don't know. I don't want to speculate about that either. But it's been so built into the propaganda against true Catholicism. I also don't want to use the phrase traditional Catholicism, but yeah, basically that phrase is saying it's the old order. It's an oddity, it's an eccentricity, it's something like a bit of a freak show that a small group belongs to. And then if you look at living tradition is one of my pet hates. When I write articles, I try and avoid that. Even if I come across it in a legitimate context, I try and avoid it because that's been used. That's been abused by the modernists to the extent that anything that they want to legitimize, they paint that over. They've twisted that phrase of a living tradition to mean things can be changed, reimagined. It can contradict previous teachings or doctrine or liturgical practices. Whereas the correct understanding, obviously, of that would be that living tradition is having kept alive and passed on what originally has been given to us. But by now, so few people understand that that's what it means. People just accept that living tradition is like it's this almost Frankenstein, ever mutating thing, and it doesn't look the same today as yesterday, and it won't look the same tomorrow. So that's really very angering language for me. And then attachment is my worst, because attachment takes the position, our position. We can call it our position, faithful Catholics' position. It takes it out of the realm of theology and puts it in the realm of psychology and emotions, and therefore like taste and preference. And again, just diminishes what the tradition and the traditional mass is all about, which is not those things. And then I just want to say, I'm trying to be charitable towards the priest and towards Father de Blignières and Diane Montana. But for me, it's quite a sign that if somebody claiming to be a traditional Catholic, I'm not saying Diane Montana is claiming that, but these priests claiming to be ultra-conservative or traditional Catholics or whatever they claim, then use language like that. It tells me you are either you've drunk too much of the Kool-Aid and you don't realize it, or you've got maybe another agenda, because those phrases like that clearly says that you are willing to compromise, and that I almost want to say either you don't understand what it's about, or you think the people don't understand, are stupid and don't understand what it's about. So yeah, that's my take on that.
I'll turn to you in a second here, Sean, but I want to bring up real quick. This was something that happened this past summer. Cardinal Burke was dunking on trad extremists who promote Latin Mass ideology. He was having an interview with Raymond Arroyo, and we won't play it, but his use of the term usus antiquor, as well as the great beauty and the more ample prayers of what he called the extraordinary form. He also used the term vitus ordo as well, to Rianne's point. And this does reflect the conciliar mindset. And I think here's the quote here that is key for us, is that Burke said, quote, "Leo will see that this isn't a question of some ideology or some kind of contrary movement in the church." He also used the term ideology. So here, they're obviously guarding against and trying to keep at bay, folks like us who would say, look, these are diametrically opposed. They're not the ordinary and the extraordinary form of the same rite. They're completely different. One is a Masonic Bugnini rite. The other one is the actual Catholic rite itself. Sean, any further thoughts here on the language that's used, as well as what Rianne is saying about how they're speaking about this attachment to the traditional Mass?
Yes, I think we're going to dig into what I'd like to say about attachment and preference. I think we're going to dig into not shortly. Just picking up on some of the stuff that you quoted from Cardinal Burke. I mean, that language is just so reckless. It really gets my goat. The stuff about radical traditionalists, extremists, and so on. Are people just so thick that they don't realize that way of speaking is actually dangerous?
Yes.
I mean, the FBI thing a few years ago proves it. To actually be, even if you don't like us and don't like what we say, and even if you don't actually think we're of the same religion as you, or something like that, whatever, it's just morally wrong to speak in that way about people. It jeopardizes people's livelihood, their legitimate liberty, as in, by which I mean walking around the world rather than being banged up somewhere in jail. I just think it's just so reckless to speak in that way. And after that FBI thing, I think anyone who does speak in that way about radical traditionalists, extremists, and so on just shows themselves to have absolutely no moral credibility whatsoever. I mean, and that stuff about beauty, I mean, it reminds me of stuff in Liberalism as a Sin. The Don, as our mutual friend Frank Wright calls Don Sadri Salvani, he talks in that about the liberal Catholic who doesn't defend the faith or make arguments for the faith or its positions based on truth, objectivity, reason, and so on. But the things like that about beauty, about utility for society, and so on. I mean, it's just he's got pretty good words on that, and just destroys it really.
Well, I had the conversation this past summer on social media, which led to me being blocked by Joseph Shaw, who's in charge of the Latin Mass Society over there in, I think, the UK. And I mentioned to him, I said, well, look, like your arguments are all simply rooted in, we want the solemnity, we want the ampleness of the prayers, the beauty of the liturgy. I said, isn't this about doctrine? Like, isn't this about actually what the Latin Mass stands for? You're trying to separate it and to decouple it from the traditional faith. I mean, that's their main error as far as I can see.
I think the question, which they perhaps aren't even cognizant of themselves, and this applies to the person who you just mentioned and others who we've discussed here, is there one religion in what you consider to be the Catholic Church, or are there multiple religions? Do you think that Father James Martin, for example, to pick on him, poor him, he's always the one picked on, right? Does he have the same religion as you or not? And I think they don't want to answer that because it's because to actually look that question in the eye leads to a sticky conversation.
Rianne, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. I gave that a lot of thought today. Just people's absolute reluctance to admit that it's different religions. You used, like you said, with James Martin as an example, but you can just run into your own personal sphere. Not myself, if I think about it. Encounters that I still have on a daily basis with people claiming to be Catholic. I often like to use the example, like you guys go, Stephen, you guys go at Iron Grit or American football there, and we've got rugby. My dad's a great lover of rugby. You Iron Grit guys can start wearing rugby jerseys. You can occupy the World Rugby Union buildings wherever it's situated. You can call your game rugby, but when you play it, and my dad comes and watch it, if you're playing American football, he's going to say, you call it rugby, you're wearing the jerseys, it looks more or less like rugby, it's definitely a sport, just like it's two religions, but it's not the same religion. And that's exactly, I mean, it's so obvious. I think a child can easily say to you, these two things aren't the same. But we are having these endless conversations, and like Sean says, these sticky conversations about, is it the same religion? And what scares me about this is we're talking about educated people here often, especially now talking about these commentators, trade-in commentators, etc. Used to defend the truth. They educated, they learned people, and now suddenly they're in this denial about what's going on, denial of the fact that that's not Catholicism, which tells me there's something, I don't want to go that route necessarily, but it's an absolute spiritual blindness. If you no longer can see something so obvious. So, yeah, that's what I look at. Just comment there.
I mean, I've got my nifty here, cup here, Cox News. Everybody can go and check those out. In here, I have some coffee. And you wouldn't know if it's decaf or full roast, because it looks the same, it tastes very similar, both of them. But that's the way I view sort of post-Vatican II Catholicism. It's decaffeinated Catholicism. There's nothing to it. It looks like it. It tastes very similar in some ways, not in many ways, and increasingly not in many ways. But there's this difference in substance, right? Which is why we need to defend the traditional faith which the Latin Mass represents. I think someone who's actually hit on this point very well is Archbishop Vigano, who issued a statement, this is back in September of last year, called Argumentum ex Concessis. And he notes here what is really going on with the Summorum Pontificum approach, which is basically reflected in this proposal by the priest. And this is what Vigano wrote, and I want your reaction to it. This is an operation of designification of the liturgy, which consists in being recognized with the right to celebrate the Tridentine Rite on the condition that the celebrant does not accept the doctrinal and moral implications of that rite. But if that Summorum priest accepts this principle, he must also accept its inverse application. Indeed, the moment one admits that the liturgy can be celebrated with regard for the traditional doctrine, without regard, for the traditional doctrine it expresses, one ends up accepting that even the Reformed liturgy can ignore the errors and heresies it insinuates, errors which no Catholic worthy of the name can absolutely ratify. And he goes to quote here Cardinal Burke himself, who said, quote, "You don't take something so rich in beauty and begin to strip away the beautiful elements without having a negative effect." And Vigano's comment is, "Nothing could be more alien to the mindset of the Roman liturgy, according to which the beauty of ceremonies and such, because it is a necessary expression of the truth it teaches and the good it practices." And this reminds me of a quote from Bishop Sanborn, who recently said, the beauty of the traditional Mass is that it caps the beauty of the doctrine. In other words, the solemnity, the prayers, etc., must be matched with the doctrine it represents, whereas the Novus Ordo indults, as well as what Father de Blignières is attempting to do here, it's like putting on a Halloween costume. You're cloaking the traditional faith with something different, that you're trying to decouple it. But Sean, I'll let you take a first whack at that quote from Archbishop Vigano.
Yeah, I was thinking of something from Bishop Sanborn as well as you were reading that, another text in relation to what I alluded to before about the positive effects of Summorum Pontificum. I mean, as I said, it's been a mixed bag, but Bishop Sanborn...
Well, Lefebvre himself said we have to be careful that what is going on here is a trap. They're trying to deceive
Absolutely.
and take our people away. So you will find oftentimes, at least what I've found, in SSPX community, is they will bring in FSSP or grant an indult to the local church to separate people from there. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, though, it's nuanced. So I think things that are set up as traps remain traps, whilst also having perhaps unintended or perhaps tolerated positive consequences. And I think that's really how it works. If there was no bait, if there was nothing attractive or positive about it, no one would go for it. But I think sometimes these things can get out of the hands of those who set them. So Bishop Sanborn said something like the coexistence of the two rights. They can't do it. They can't coexist. One drives out the other. Not in every case. So you do get people who are wholly, as we said, attached to the old rite, who retain doctrinal problems. But as I think what we've seen over the last maybe, it's 20 years now. Gosh, is the existence of the Motu Mass, the Summorum Pontificum Mass, has indeed driven people in a particular direction, led them to find other more dangerous truths, shall we say, and that's the effect of it. And I think that's part of what Traditionis Custodes was doing, was trying to put a lid on it. But I think amongst these people, there are factions, and they've got different schools of thought. They've got different ways they want to go about trapping us, essentially.
Rian?
Yes. I was just mention something there. I was talking what Cardinal Burke said about it being beautiful and solemn, and sort of reverting to that as a defense. Sort of the problem with that always is, as soon as you shoot only for if your defense of the traditional Latin Mass is, and I don't just want to talk about the traditional Latin Mass. For me, obviously, it's about the faith. But if you want to defend the traditional Latin Mass, and your only defense is it's beautiful and it's solemn and it's reverential and it's valid, then you play into the enemy's hands, if I can call them the enemy, into the modernist hands, because that again just makes it a preference. Because what you experience as solemn or reverential or whatever might be different from what I experience as the same. So yeah, that sort of talk from Cardinal Burke is not helpful either. But I've never really regarded him as a true friend of tradition or the true Catholic faith, whether that's unpopular opinion or not. But yeah.
Yeah, you write in your blog, Rian, that, quote, "We do not need to negotiate with heretics and enemies of Christ for what rightfully belongs to Mother Church and the faithful." And I think that's the crux of the matter here, is that, you both, as well as I myself, as well as I think Lefebvre's most mature thought, has always, I think, been that, contrary to what we even hear in the SSPX in recent years, that we have a right, as a matter of justice, to the traditional Latin Mass. But I've always flipped that sort of approach on its head and said, well, doesn't God have a right to a pope who's not a modernist? Don't Catholics across the world have a right to the Latin liturgy? Because we're basically occupied by usurpers and squatters, is the terms I've been using to describe the Romans in recent years. So why are we sitting here trying to seek to be, as Sean, your title of your article is literally a side chapel in the conciliar synodal church? And so why are we just trying to beg for crumbs when in reality that's not a rectification of the situation? On principle, this is a matter of complete injustice, and so we're just sitting here begging to be a side chapel. That to me is scandalous of itself, and which I think earlier we talked about, that was the error of Dom Gerard, and even the SPX back then understood, hey, this is an erroneous and unprincipled position.
Yeah. So I just like to drop in there, Stephen, and say this. When it comes to that whole thing about when I say don't negotiate with these people, don't ask for favors, don't ask for legitimacy or nothing from them, is, again, this might not be a very intellectual argument, but this is the way I see it. Would you go to, I would like to ask these people, would they go to the Anglican authoritative structures and ask them for permission to be Catholic? No. Or if they can say the Latin Mass, no, they wouldn't. Would you go to the Southern Baptists and ask them for permission to be Catholic? No, you wouldn't. So why go to these people who are currently in the Vatican, like you rightly say, I love that term, squatters, who are peddling another religion as bad, if not worse, than Anglicism or baptism or whatever, and go and ask them for permission to be a Catholic, a real Catholic, a traditional Catholic, or Orthodox Catholic, whatever you want to call it. That's for me, it's just like, I'm so tired of us having to negotiate with these people and play nice and be nice when they actually got no right to decide for us, because they are practicing and peddling another religion.
Mm. Well, Sean, you brought this up too in your posts, and you're over there or across the pond, and you talk about the Anglicanization of the church here. You talk about the Novus Ordo Church being a high church, traditionalist, extraordinary form wing of the church, a conservative wing, an evangelical, charismatic, renewal wing, a low church, standard parish Novus Ordo wing, and a liberal or modernist wing. Can you expand upon that for us? That's really, I think, really insightful.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, as we've sort of been saying, since Vatican II, there have been people trying to negotiate themselves a little spot in this, a little side chapel, as we said, or a spot in the big tent. And I think really some of the stuff that Rian was just saying here, the reason why they go to these people for these things is because they have a naturalistic understanding of the church. They understand a man is wearing white, he's in Rome, therefore, etc. That's the problem here. So what they've been trying to do is they've been trying to secure the existence of themselves and their religion alongside the new thing. And I think some of them aren't really sure exactly why they're doing that. They don't know whether it's because, like I said, they can't answer that question. They don't know whether it's because they have a preference for it, but they think the other thing's totally fine, or whether they think that they're going to use that to get a foothold in order to agitate for something more, or they think they're going to save the church or something like that. There's a broad spectrum of opinion amongst those people. Some of them will completely avoid the Novus Ordo on principle. Some of them will even avoid the priests who have been ordained in the new rites on principle, whilst existing in that kind of regularized situation. And what they've done over the last few decades is they've more or less successfully at different times secured a little enclave for themselves where things can be quite good, really. They've they can have their proper catechism, more or less. They can have their rights and so on, and happy days. They can raise their children and so on. But what they've done is they have adopted the ecclesiology, if you can call it that, of the Anglican Communion. I had in the article a great text from Cardinal Newman, who said this while he was still an Anglican. He said, "Men of Catholic views are truly but a party in our church." That list you just gave here, it's a list of parties, and it's not a list of theological schools. We shouldn't, people kind of will say things like that. Oh, there's always been a Thomist school versus a Scotus school, or there's Eastern Catholic theology. Yeah, but they're all Catholic, right? They're all Catholic, even if they're wrong. They haven't been in this or that thing. They haven't been condemned as such yet. But they're all clearly, at least at the outset, compatible with the Catholic religion because they are all Catholic. But this idea of having competing religions, because it is a competing religion, the modernist religion is different to what you find in the FSSP. If you have like the best FSSP parish or even the worst FSSP parish, it's a different religion to what's found in the standard parish church, and it's a different religion to what's found in that place in Syracuse in New York, which is totally wacky, or whatever. So you have these. This is how the Anglicans see themselves. It's a broad church with various wings. Like the list you said there, they have their high church ritualist or Anglo-Catholic wing that's been taken different forms over the last couple of centuries. The low church and the liberal wing. But they're all considered to be part of the same body, the same religion. They're all Anglicans in good standing, but the similarities start to become quite painful, really, because you consider that high church wing, they believe that they were carrying on the true Catholic religion that had just been reformed in the Reformation, but was still the true Catholic religion of England, and they did so. They kind of acknowledged that they were doing so alongside a bunch of errors and so on, and it was their job to fix the Church of England and bring it back into its course. I mean, this is this is difficult when we get here, but the problem is that this involves a different definition of the church, and not just that, but a denial of several key doctrinal points about the nature of the church, both about her properties and about how she's recognized as such, as the true church in the world, which is another way of saying how she's made visible. So ultimately, in order to kind of preserve this naturalistic, legalistic idea of the church as a juridical structure, they actually render her invisible. They deny the visibility of the church as such, at least as according to the popes and theologians would have understood it prior to the council. Do you want me to carry on riffing on this, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in your article you reference Professor de Mattei as well as Archbishop Lefebvre, and I think now we're getting into, well, if there's multiple parties, different faiths, different expressions of the Catholic faith in this church, well, how is this the actual church itself if it's run by opponents to the faith, and their worship is different and distinct from actually others? What does that mean for this institution that calls itself the church? It simply cannot be the church.
Right. I mean, so there's always been a plurality of rights in the church, but so we should be clear on what is meant and what is not meant when we talk about the unity of the church. One particular aspect of what's meant is the visible unity of the church in her external profession of faith. Okay, so that's the what is. It does what it says on the tin. It's not saying that everybody must have the virtue of faith internally, but it's saying that everybody must profess the same faith externally. This doesn't exclude, as I said, different schools of theology, be they as close as like scholastic schools or as far as the Latin versus the Eastern schools. It doesn't exclude the possibility that some people can be mistaken about things, or that people can be disputing about open questions or questions which don't rise to the level of faith, about dogma and so on. But it does exclude the idea that the church is just a kind of legal group of men, like the New York Lawn Bowls Club or the South African rugby team or something like that. That's an organisation which is which can tolerate different views about different things. But the church isn't like that. The church is constituted as a visible unity of faith and charity, and the one way she's rendered visible is through that external profession of faith. This was considered to be so true, so obvious, that it was considered a mark of the church, and in fact the principal mark of the church, by which the true church would be recognized from all the other false claimants. Because you would look at the Catholic Church and you'd say, okay, everybody there believes and professes the same thing, with the caveats I mentioned before. You couldn't say that about the Anglican Church or the others. And so that was understood and is one manifestation of an aspect of the mark of unity, which we mention in the Creed every Sunday and High Feast Day. So the problem here is not that people are adopting a false understanding of the ecclesiology. Like you mentioned de Mattei, he said something: there is only one Catholic Church in which today cohabit a confused and fragmentary way different and counterpoised theologies and philosophies. It is more correct to speak of a Bergoglian theology, of a Bergoglian philosophy, of a Bergoglian morality, and if one wishes, of a Bergoglian religion. I'm sorry, you can't say that, but here's the rub: you can say it because it's true. That's the reality. In that structure, which is based in, which has its headquarters in the Vatican and has Leo XIV as its head, it is true that it is radically disunited in its faith, and it's true that there are multiple religions there. So what's the solution there? Is the solution that the papal teaching and the settled body of theology on the nature of the church and on her unity is wrong and needs to be rethought or denied or something like that? That's one option that have been taken by some people, but I don't think you can take that if you want to remain a Catholic. I think that what has to be done is you have to re-examine the facts before you, because Catholic theology is in a sense more certain than those kind of your interpretation of external facts. And I think that's one way by which we arrive at the conclusion that, at least taken simply, you can't say that body is the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I'd like your thoughts on all that, Rian. But before, I just want to add that it does seem to me those who posit themselves to be leaders of the so-called traditional movement talk about strategy, taking up space. We are going to promote the Latin Mass wherever we can. What they're, I think, implicitly missing, or what they're missing, is that they treat the church in what the manner in you're speaking, Sean, is they're treating it like a parliament. Like, we have different factions, we're going to win over time, and we're going to march down the football field and eventually score a touchdown in 50 years when all the modernists are dead. But that's the church is integral, it's whole. And so, but they want to take the faith, decouple it from, take the liturgy, which is a symbol, an avatar of the traditional faith, and then decouple it and then use it as a wedge issue, like sort of grievance politics here in the U.S., where you're going to hold protests and things and think that's like the way forward.
I just want to add to what Sean was talking about, the different factions and sort of different religions now within Catholicism, and can it be, etc. Another aspect of that is, now we don't just have a situation where there's a Catholic Church, a visible Catholic Church, that's got all these different wings, as you put it in your article, but we've got a situation where there's one wing. Let's just say there's two wings for argument's sake, but one part of the church is literally making war on another part. It's persecuting another part of the church, which also tells me there's something majorly wrong, because people might say that's conspiracy talk, or maybe I'm just being extreme or controversial, whatever, but let's be honest. From where I'm sitting, it really doesn't seem, I want to state it as a fact, that the people in power are trying to eradicate traditional Catholicism, which I always say in my articles, and that is real Catholicism. And I mean, if you look at stuff like what's happening in Charlotte and the removal of kneelers and all these things, whatever, we all know, we weekly, daily basis, we hear about it, we write about it, we make videos about it, etc. It is like a war on Catholicism inside the Catholic Church. And that's what it's always so amazing to me, and ironic, and wryly ironic, that we're not getting so much flack from outside the church. Catholics are getting flack from inside the church. So you've got that as well. It's not just a happy family within the church, and I do this and you do that, and we'd all just coexist. It's literally that part of the church is making war on Catholics, on traditional Catholics.
That's right, and that's why the Father de Blignières situation proposal is not a solution at all to this. It's it's an attempt to have autonomy and to kind of basically say, we're immune, you can't attack us, you can't persecute us, but it's ignoring the more fundamental reality which you just described, Rian.
Well, and you even see that again in the language itself. We talked about this earlier. We're just simply attached to it. We just want to be basically left alone. And I mean, really, Sean, let me ask you this. Do you think this is even much of a change in the status quo? Because in years past, I mean, there's been various proposals. There was obviously the Ecclesia Dei communities, and then that was obviously undone by Bergoglio. This real proposal really isn't anything new. In fact, it would really just simply corral, as some have said, all the what I'll just call the neotrads into a system that is reliant upon the goodwill of the modernist usurpers in the Vatican to even exist. So there's no, any sort of protections. It would seem to me, at least based on this plan. I'm sure there's different proposals Father would put forth to maybe secure that. But what is your overall read on what this actually would do, and in regards to the state of the sort of Ecclesia Dei groups as it is at present?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's not going to change anything in particular, in the sense that these people have already made their deal, so to speak. What it would do, in theory, would grant them a bit more autonomy to do what they want. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the idea of parallel jurisdictions and so on. You have the personal ordinariates, or the military ordinariates. We'll leave the Anglican ordinariate out of things. I'm not entirely sure exactly how the personal prelature system of Opus Dei works. And you also have, obviously, the foreign Eastern exarchies, the dioceses that are abroad from their kind of home territories that exist parallel to the Latin one. So that idea of having a sort of parallel life is nothing kind of particularly problematic about that. But the point is that all of these things can be rescinded like that. Just like we've seen there've been things like that with Opus Dei, the rescinding of Summorum Pontificum and replacement with Traditionis Custodes. That was supposed to be a guaranteed thing, but the reality is there are no guaranteed things like this. The only guarantee is the integrity of the faith, which stands kind of independent of it's the measuring stick, essentially, in some ways. So it doesn't change the situation there, but it would have the effect, I think, of corralling back, as you said, the number of people who have attached themselves in a less firm way to groups like the SSPX or even groups like the Resistance or something. It would perhaps corral them back into that, because they'd have the impression of having what Evil in War described back in 1963, of a kind of uniate church where they can exist independently and safely, but it's not a good direction for them, because for the reasons we're discussing, as well as the fact that it involves a fundamental compromise on ecclesiology. It doesn't, beyond all the questions of Vatican II, like religious liberty and so on, it implicitly accepts it's a sellout, essentially.
We have about 10 minutes left, gentlemen. Again, thank you for being here. This is a fascinating conversation. I hope our viewers are enjoying it. Sean, what you just said there reminds me of a quote, and you included this in your blog on this topic, from Archbishop Lefebvre, again, post-1988. He said, quote, "We must not be under any illusions. Consequently, we are in the thick of a great fight. We are fighting a fight guaranteed by a whole line of popes. Hence, we should have no hesitation or fear. Hesitation such as, quote, why should we be going on our own? After all, why not join with Rome?" He said, quote, if Rome and the Pope were in line with tradition, if they were carrying on the work of the popes of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, of course. But then he goes on to say, we must never waver for one moment, either in not being with those who are in the process of betraying us. Some people are always admiring their grass and their neighbors' fields. Instead of looking to their friends, to the church's defenders, they look to our enemies on the other side. And he goes on to say we cannot shake hands with them. So that, to me, seems to be the issue here, is that you will find those who are so sort of paranoid about having a legal connection inside the church. We hear this all the time from various influencers, stay within the church, don't leave the church. Well, Lefebvre here is saying, basically, to stay faithful to the Catholic faith, you have to, in some way, separate yourself from this juridical structure that calls itself the Catholic Church, and not be fearful about that. Because when you have the faith, you are secure in the rule of the norm of the faith. And although there might be obviously divisions outside of that, there's no unity in this conciliar church anyway. As you just talked about, John, in your post, there's Novus Ordo liberal churches, there's charismatic churches in this Novus Ordo institution, there's somewhat conservative ones. So everybody has we're already fractured as an institution. So, I really despise this line that's often used, is to say, well, stay inside the church. Well, again, what church are you talking about? We have no fear to go, quote, on our own.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important that we recognize that according to sound theology, that when we say the norm of the faith and so on, it is the hierarchy, it is the papacy and so on that provides us that objective assurance that we are following the faith. So it's not just about our kind of private judgment of this.
Right.
This current situation we're in is utterly abnormal.
Yes.
So when the Archbishop says, yes, if the Rome and the Pope were in line with tradition, I think it is important just to say at this juncture to profess and affirm clearly that it is not possible for the Pope not to be in line with tradition in the way that we've seen over the last 60 years. And this is a key reason for why we would say that the see has been vacant and that these men haven't been legitimate popes. So I think it is important we have that clarity on the objectivity there. There's a sort of, there's a principle of non-contradiction that comes in here. It's not just we're saying, hey, man, this isn't in line with my idea of the faith. It is a case of it's not possible to assent to what we know with certainty, having been taught prior, what the content of the faith is, and this new thing that we're being given here, and that forces certain further conclusions. It's not like we're saying, oh man, the Holy Ghost is illuminating me and I've got this feeling that this is the case here. So yeah, I just want to kind of get that there.
Rian.
Yeah, I just want to say about that as well, regarding the quote. Yes, we are in a fight. I try and keep it simple always. The way we wage this war or fight this fight is by sticking to the faith that we've that's been handed down and that's been practiced as Catholics until 1962. A year and a few months ago, I wrote an article where the headline was "Pray for Pope Francis that he converts to Catholicism," and I got a lot of flack for that. I doubled down on that now, on that sentiment at least. What needs to happen is ridiculous, this thing about staying in the church. What church must we stay in? The false church? Must we stay in that church? It's ridiculous. What needs to happen is Rome needs to repent. Pope Leo needs to repent. 99% of the hierarchy needs to repent. And the wool's been pulled over more than 1 billion Catholics' eyes. They unfortunately have to repent and return to Catholicism. That's what needs to happen. Meanwhile, we must just keep our eyes on the faith, practice the faith as we know it should be practiced. Those
on the opposite side they'll say, well, look, that's all fine and dandy to say that, but in the meantime, we have liberals and modernists, and the church is infiltrated, and so to get a win when we can have it, having a more Latin masses, that's going in the right direction, and you're being unrealistic, you're not pragmatic, you're living in a fantasy world. What do either or both of you say to those arguments? Because those are very common. Those are the ones that will be used in response, I'm sure, to this episode. So I wanted to give that a chance to respond to.
I mean, do you believe in God or not? That's my question. Do you believe in a supernatural church? Do you believe in grace? Yes, of course it's unrealistic. Of course it's against all odds. Yes, obviously. This isn't news to us, right? So, okay, it's a win. Yeah, great. More people will have access to the traditional mass. Yes, I agree. And is it valid or not? That's another question. But they'll have more exposure to the true faith, and it will likely have a positive effect on some of them. Okay, but does this change the reality that's before us, which is that this is a trap? And I'm sure Father de Blignières doesn't see it that way. I'm sure he's of good faith and so on. But these, the guys in the Vatican are the heirs of 2,000 years worth of diplomacy, right? They have the oldest. They've usurped and taken the reins of the mechanisms of the oldest continuing thing in the world, right? And so they've got traditions of diplomacy and so on, which are supposed to be used for the good of the church. And when you have a true pope, and he's got a good curia, they are indeed. But at present, they're being used against us. It's like a child playing chess against a grandmaster and betting his parents' house on it. You don't do that. It's dumb. You don't play chess with these people. They're light years ahead of you.
Mother oyster.
You don't play games with them. You stay away. Okay,
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Rian?
Yeah, no, I do totally agree with what Sean's saying there. I don't really want to add something. Just, I don't even bother arguing with people who say that to me. Two descriptions of God that sort of fell out of fashion, you don't often hear as descriptive terms, is God is awful and terrible. And today we've got different connections to that. God is a jealous God. I want to please God, who gave us this beautiful system called Catholicism. I want to please him because in his wisdom, he knew that's what we need. I want to practice that. I'm going to have discussions with these people about whether we should or shouldn't, or how it should be done. And then just as far as these many traditional Latin masses that we probably can have, if we have those by permission of these anti-Catholics, my question is this: if Rome decides tomorrow that two men are allowed to marry each other, or that Muslims are our brothers, or they're already saying that, will these priests who are our shepherds and these bishops in these alternative jurisdictions be able to tell the faithful this is wrong? No, they won't. So you have this Latin Mass and all this other filth will have to be accepted. So, yeah, that's like an argument I don't bother to have with these people. I'd rather please God and practice the faith that he gave us.
Yeah. Before giving you both the last word here, my only last thought on it is, well, because a lot of people will say, well, we shouldn't be too loud, we shouldn't protest too much because, well, the local ordinary might take away the only, extraordinary form of the Mass in the entire diocese. And if that goes away, well, my children, they're going to be without the traditional Mass. I have to drive 3 hours.
Yeah, I just want to say, in the same vein, what you just said, Stephen, I'd rather die a martyr, God with God's mercy, than compromise with these people. I'd rather return to the catacombs if that needs to be, but to compromise is not an option. And I would just pray and wish more Catholics will come to that point in that decision, that compromise is not an option.
I'm very sensitive to those sorts of arguments because people are in very difficult situations, and I prefer to stick to speaking about generalities and principles rather than giving people practical advice, like like you just mentioned there. I hope though that perhaps that some of the things we've discussed here and some of the other considerations that we've at least touched on or alluded to would make people start to think whether or not attending those masses is a good idea in the first place. So it's not about behave nicely so that you get to keep your situation. Perhaps your situation isn't actually God's will for you anyway. That can lead to really difficult situations, where perhaps you're raising your kids somewhere where they can only go to Mass once a month or less, and there's no other Catholics around, and perhaps they're weird and not very nice. That's
it's a fair point.
I feel for that.
Yeah, let me interject real quick before giving you the last word. I have plenty of friends and family who, they have children, and that is a very real situation. And there are many practical things. I mean, I don't have children of my own. I know families who are traditional who have a dozen children, and there is no SSPX. There's no other church around, and so they're going to some of these Ecclesia Dei groups, and there's a number of factors that you have to bring in when you're raising children. Socialization, schooling, etc. But I think just in terms of practical principle, right? I mean, we're trying to get to the principles here and say, all right, like here's what we think is the correct way to think about this. So I guess, I would not be judging persons who are, trying to exist in that milieu. It's just a matter of, we're trying to draw principles and say, okay, like here's what seems to be the most consistent. So I guess to allow for some room for flexibility, at least on my own. Again, I wouldn't pretend to give advice strictly speaking either. I think it's a good caveat that you've added there. So.
Sean, I just also want to make that very clear. When I say I really want to encourage Catholics not to compromise, I mean it as a principle. I've always steered clear in these situations. My heart breaks. I get like messages all the time from people who say we can't attend the Latin Mass. There's only Novus Ordo around. What must we do? And I don't have answers for them. It's very difficult. It's an extremely difficult situation. But like you say yourself, if people can start considering the sort of underlying principles and fundamentals, then maybe they can make good, solid decisions from there on. But I myself don't have answers for people, and I'm just merely touting no compromise as a principle. People should build on it. But I'm not telling them, don't go sit at home or whatever. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be situations where that's the only choice, and it's going to be immensely difficult. And I think it's important for those people when they realize that is their situation, they need to take care to mitigate the harms that are going to come from it. But wherever we go, there's going to be harms and dangers facing us, and we need to mitigate against them. So there's no easy answer one way or another, really, is there?
Yeah, and that gets into obviously the issue of being home alone, and ultimately you might just have to move somewhere, but that's up to persons and obviously their priests. So
sure.
Any last thoughts, gentlemen, before we sign off?
I'll give the last word from my end to Bishop Bernard Fellet of the SSPX, who said in 2003 of ideas of making arrangements and of little things like Father de Blignières' proposal, quote, their perspective is pluralism. Their thinking goes something like this. Oh, look, if we have progressive people who do silly things as members of the church, then we should also have a place for those who like tradition, a place in the middle of this circus, of this zoo, a place for dinosaurs and the prehistoric animals. That's our place. But just stay in your zoo cage, they will train us. You can get your food, the old mass, that's for the dinosaurs, but only for the dinosaurs. Don't give that to the other zoo animals, they will be killed, end quote. Those words were true in 2003, and they're true now.
Amen. Well, I will bring up here on the screen one last time. Go to the WM Review Substack, wmreview.org, to read Sean's essay on this particular topic, as well as plenty of other topics you can see here on the screen if you're watching. One of the more recent articles was the last sermon of Monsignor Gerard de Laurier, noted theologian as well as confessor once upon a time of Pius XII, as well as an article here on St. Thomas Becket. And obviously go to the Radical Fidelity Substack of Rian and read about his own views on the proposal that we're talking about today, as well as plenty of other topics that are of significance. These are fantastic blogs that both of our guests today have been cultivating and growing over the past sometimes months, but especially the last several years for Sean, who's been in this space for quite a while now. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you both. It's been great fun.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this special episode of Church and State. Be sure to go to the Substack, Cox News, as well as our YouTube channel to watch more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.